This is part of the series, The Gospel Revisited, and we are going to look at Romans chapter 10, verse 14 as our reference. Someone said, God gave us 2 ears, but only 1 mouth. And some people would say that's because He wanted us to spend twice as much time listening as talking. Others claim that because God knew listening was twice as hard as talking, and so He gave us 2 ears. Ears are meant for hearing. And so does the direct statement of Christ to His followers in Matthew 11, verse 15. He who has ears, let him hear. Now this is an instruction that is not difficult to observe, right? After all, are not ears supposed to be for hearing? If ears are for hearing, then why make a command to hear if you have ears? The reason is quite simple. The presence of ears does not necessarily mean there is hearing. For those of you who do not believe me, just try to talk with somebody whose hearing aid is turned off. They have ears, but they cannot hear. There is an assumption that when one has a pair of ears, he would actually hear. But this assumption may not necessarily be true in many situations. Growing up, my parents used to pinch our ears, little children, whenever they do not observe what they have told us to do. How many of you are parents here? Justin, you're not qualified. And how many of you were tempted at one point to pinch the ears of your children because they do not observe what you told them to do? Okay. I'm glad some of you are honest. What about the rest of you? Today, of course, doing that would be what? Child abuse. The experience, however, declares a powerful reminder. That is, that you and I better use our ears for hearing, otherwise those ears will become objects of punishment, or maybe ridicule. It seems, however, that there is more to the mechanism of hearing than just exposing one's ear to a sound. Which brings us to the foundation of our message today. Romans 10, verse 14 reads, "And how can they believe in one whom they have not heard?" And so the central thought of my message is simple. Hearing comes before believing. When I speak of hearing here, I speak of the mechanism of receiving a proclaimed or an announced message. Of course, there are other mechanisms to receive a message. One of them is reading. People can read a message and receive it. But today we are going to look at hearing. We are unable to make conscious decision to believe if we have not heard. Of course, we are unable to hear if nobody announced it to us or proclaimed it upon our hearing. Briefly, I'd like to share with you 3 insights that we can gain regarding hearing. First, hearing is not all about ears. Hearing is not an exclusive activity of the ears. Although we often use the word hear to refer to the entrance of sound vibration into our ears, whether the sound is identifiable or not, the use of the term hearing is not limited to ear work. There are a few verses of scripture which provide additional understanding regarding hearing as not necessarily an exclusive activity of the ears. So let me share 3 examples. Isaiah 29, verse 18. It reads, "In that day, the deaf will hear the words of the scroll, and out of gloom and darkness, the eyes of the blind will see." If hearing indeed is limited to the experience of one who has functioning ears, then the deaf could not experience any hearing at all. But here we are told by the prophet Isaiah that the deaf could potentially hear. Clearly, therefore, hearing is more than just the mechanism of sound passing through the ears. Hearing is the receiving of the word through whatever human sensory faculty. If one has not received the word, in spite of the clarity of the sound of the voice of the messenger, really, there was no hearing that occurred. The second passage is John chapter 8, verse 47. He who belongs to God hears what God says. The reason you do not hear is that you do not belong to God. There is an equally dynamic and powerful force which occurs alongside the activity of hearing. And that is the willingness to take the message and allow it to change one's heart, one's character, and one's relationships. And this willingness is founded upon 2 relationships. First is the relationship between the receiver and the message. The receiver must trust the message. All right? Being conveyed in that message is powerful, and it can activate change. This is what belonging to God, which causes one to hear, really mean. If you do not trust Christ, the message, capital letter M, you will not observe what He tells you to do. So there has to be a relationship between the receiver and the message. And the second relationship is between the receiver and the messenger. Again, the receiver must trust the messenger as one worthy of hearing. If I do not believe the power of the message, then I will reject it. In the same way, if I do not trust the integrity of the messenger, I will also potentially reject the message. How many of you here have received some form of criticism? Either from a friend, or from a teacher, or from a co-worker, or from a supervisor maybe. For those of you who have received criticism, I offer this counsel for your consideration. Whenever you receive a criticism, consider the source. If you know the level of trustworthiness of the source, it will help you to make a decision to either pay attention or not to the criticism. Someone will criticize you, but you don't even know who this person is. So you have a decision. Are you going to listen or not? But if you trust the messenger, then you will also give power to that criticism. The third passage is 2 Timothy chapter 4, verse 3. For the time will come when men will not put up with sound doctrine. Instead, to suit their own desires, they will gather around them a great number of teachers to say what their itching ears want to hear. Among other lessons, the verse reminds us today of the possibility of what we call selective hearing. Not everything the ears are exposed to will be heard. You see, the self often seeks what is pleasurable, and the ears have a filter to that is pleasurable or not. And if it's pleasurable, the ears will allow it to go through. If not, it will reject. The message then is filtered by the ears. There are some people who even expand this principle. They would say something like this: if I don't hear it, it isn't there. So if they have not heard that there is traffic congestion on the highway, then there is no traffic. If they do not hear the cry of one family member, then there is no pain. There is no suffering. Another way of saying this is they will say, oh, everything is all right. There is no pain in my family. This is like someone who has not heard the warning, and therefore the storm is not real. They get the surprise of their lives when they find out, sometimes a little too late, that there's actually traffic, that there's actually pain in the family, or that there is actually a storm and the storm is on their way, or maybe the storm has already passed through. What then is hearing if it is not an exclusive activity of the ears? This brings us to the second point of the message. Hearing is receiving the word. Did you hear that? Yes. It is receiving the word. After the receiving process may occur through whatever means. And several means through which the word is conveyed and received. For example, one can read a story. The story may be that of someone's dynamic faith, or maybe a letter of testimony that was written to you. During the first 2 years of my Christian life, I read the stories of known men and women of the Christian faith. I was tremendously encouraged by the integration of faith in intellect by the famous British writer C.S. Lewis. I read stories of early missionaries who traveled to communist China. I read a journey of Albert Schweitzer, missionary to Africa, after leaving the promise of a lucrative medical practice. At one time, Dr. Schweitzer was asked why he was traveling third class on a boat in one of his trips. And his reply was, because there is no fourth class. I also read a heartwarming story of the 10 Boom sisters under the oppressive communist regime in Europe. I spent almost half of my income reading books. And I'm still reading today. What I'm saying is, you and I can receive the word because someone wrote a letter, or someone wrote a book or a pamphlet, or someone explained a changed life through a message that he sent to you via FedEx. Actually, most of the New Testament letters are actually messages written to churches in a written form. If not for letter writing, there would be no epistles of Paul, and we would miss the principles of truth which guide Christian living, as we see in the New Testament. Another means is observing an example. You may have an opportunity to watch someone respond to different life challenges. You are encouraged because somebody demonstrated virtues that you see in their lives: peace, perseverance, stability, calmness, hope, and enduring trust in the midst of trouble. Later on, you discovered that these exemplified acts are simple results of the individual's personal faith. One Sunday morning in the year 1865, a black man entered a fashionable church in Richmond, Virginia. When communion was served, he walked down the aisle and knelt on the altar. A rustle of resentment could be heard among the members of the congregation. How dare he? After all, believers in the church used a common cup. It's not like today where you have a separate little cup for everybody. Before, they had a big cup that they shared. And so this predominantly white congregation, they were surprised. I'm using a politically correct term, surprised. But really, they were resentful. How can this black person come and join us? Well, there was a distinguished layman that stood up, stepped forward to the altar, knelt beside this black brother, and both of them received the elements of the Lord's Supper. The person was General Robert E. Lee. He set an example, and the rest of the members of the congregation kept quiet, and they started participating in the Lord's Supper together with his black brother. You observe an example from somebody. And then the third means, you experience restoration. So you read a story, you observe an example, or you experience restoration. And this restoration is personal in nature. It may occur in the physical area, your health, restoration of broken relationships, restoration of psycho-emotional brokenness, or some may even experience restoration of their material resources. So how many of you here have experienced restoration in your life? Nobody? Well, recently, I had been very concerned that I will be transitioned to injectable insulin by my doctor because of my diabetes. Actually, I shared this with some of you. I remember I shared this with Brother Lou as well, and Luz. And I was thinking, oh, okay, I'm going to have injection every day now. About 2 weeks ago, my wife and I decided to embark on a diet. And dramatically, the glucose went down. For a long time, I haven't seen my glucose go down below 100. This time it was 72, 82, 89, the highest would be 91. The first time I took my glucose, it was so low, Chelly says, oh, your machine doesn't work anymore. Maybe you need to buy another machine. Because you see, you're supposed to have a new machine every year. Well, we continued checking, and the glucose has remained really low. Last Friday, I visited my doctor. She was so surprised to see all the lab work gone down. And so instead of transitioning me to injectable insulin, she decided to remove 2 of my medications. And this morning when I took my glucose, it was 91 without those 2 medications. The reason I'm sharing this with you is because I attribute this to God, because He has shown wisdom to me to pursue this particular pattern of lifestyle. Shelley was saying, isn't this too limiting for us in terms of what we eat? I said, well, you know, I have been preaching, you can look at the cup as half empty or half full. Instead of looking at it as limiting, why don't we look at it as the Lord is teaching us how to eat differently? You see, many of our diseases in the United States are diseases of excesses. We are not careful, I know I'm one of them, of what I take into my mouth. And as a result, after 24 hours, I suffer. How many of you here has that kind of experience? Where you know this food is not supposed to be for you, but it's just so good to look at. And you don't have any willpower to regulate yourself, and so you started eating 1 bite, and before you found it, you already had 6 bites. And then the following morning, you suffer. Whatever the suffering is. I know if I take a lot of oily foods, you know, my trip to the restrooms the following day will be more frequent than regular. Many of you have restored relationships, broken relationships, the Lord restored you. Many of you have restored material resources. For some reason, the Lord provided all of these at one point in your lives. The experience of restoration can be a simple reminder that God is God. And He is true to His word. Psalm 23 is one of my favorites. I know many of you memorized this. But the first 3 verses reads, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not be in want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside quiet waters. He restores my soul." But a major component of restoration towards wholeness is the admission of brokenness. If we keep on denying that we are broken, we will not entrust to the Lord His capacity to restore. Therefore, we will not call upon Him for help.